Some people appear cold, distant, or difficult to connect with, but in reality, they're simply trying to avoid being hurt again. Pain changes how a person exists, and often, the most painful part is that no one even notices. Carl Jung once said that when pain isn't understood, it retreats and becomes behavior. In this video, you'll gain insight into the behaviors of people who've experienced deep emotional suffering, why they act the way they do, and more importantly, how to transform unconscious pain into conscious awareness. Stay with me till the end. This might help you view yourself with less guilt and others with greater compassion. Not everyone who seems cold is emotionless. Many are just cautious. Not everyone who's hard to love is unloving. Some have simply learned to question love. Behaviors often labeled as distant or difficult are, in fact, ways the psyche adapts to overwhelming pain. When emotional pain isn't given space to be felt, it turns into a protective shield. Over time, that shield can appear to be part of our identity, but it's not. It's armor, silently assembled thread by thread for emotional survival. Jung believed pain is the currency the soul uses to grow in awareness. He didn't glorify suffering, but viewed it as a necessary part of psychological growth. If we listen with respect, deep pain can show us not just where we're wounded, but where we've stopped truly living. Pain doesn't always shape temperament. It shapes survival strategies. People who've suffered greatly often develop intricate psychological defenses, sometimes invisible even to themselves. Their ways of reacting, relating, protecting, or withdrawing are not accidental. They're part of a system built to keep the original hurt from resurfacing. Judging these behaviors is like criticizing a scar without understanding the wound that came before it. There's a different way to look, a lens that asks not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. This shift can turn suffering into understanding. It helps us recognize behavior as a signal, a pattern, a map, because the psyche communicates through symbols, emotional cycles, and repetition. A reaction that seems excessive may simply be the echo of an old wound longing to be acknowledged. The wounded soul doesn't crave pity, it wants to be seen. And being seen with empathy is the first step to stop reacting unconsciously and start healing intentionally. When we understand that pain shapes us, but doesn't define us, we begin to slowly remove the emotional armor we mistook for our skin. In its place appears a space, still delicate but real, where awareness begins to touch what once only knew how to protect itself. Some pain doesn't vanish, it restructures itself inside us. If it's not welcomed, it becomes a living core that keeps responding, even when the original threat is long gone. Jung referred to these as complexes, unconscious emotional structures with a life of their own. They're not flaws, but self-protective mechanisms developed to withstand what the ego couldn't handle alone. Consider a person who faced deep rejection in childhood. It may not have been overt, just a quiet absence, a lack of emotional presence. That experience can evolve into a rejection complex. Later in life, even minor instances like a delayed message or a neutral expression may trigger an intense reaction. It's not an overreaction. It's the complex speaking again with the same emotional force as the original wound. Jung believed we all carry complexes. The real issue is when they control us. When a complex is triggered, it can override our awareness, leading to emotional states we don't fully understand, sudden tears, withdrawal, disproportionate anger, or deep emptiness. These reactions aren't irrational. They make perfect sense within the emotional framework of someone who's endured profound pain. People who've suffered often come to believe they're too sensitive, too reactive, or too complicated. But these complexes function like alarm systems, alerting the unconscious to present events that resemble past wounds, even if the conscious mind can't immediately connect the dots. These emotional patterns don't disappear through willpower. They change when they are acknowledged. Healing begins with inner listening, asking, what part of me needs care right now? Where is this reaction really coming from? What is this pain trying to protect? Awareness doesn't erase the complex, but it removes its silent control. Complexes aren't weaknesses, they're emotional memories, and when we learn to listen without fear or judgment, they quiet down. The soul can begin to reorganize, not to erase what happened, but to create space for pain to be felt and tended. To distrust isn't coldness, it's a form of survival, especially for those hurt in places that once felt safe. Trusting again isn't casual, it's a risk. The ego, in its role of protecting us, learns to avoid it. Even in safe situations, the soul remains alert. The unconscious doesn't differentiate between past and present. It only recognizes emotional patterns and reacts accordingly. This constant vigilance is an adaptation to a world that once felt unsafe. It might stem from betrayal, abandonment, or emotional neglect. The significance isn't in the size of the event, but in the psychological impact it left behind. Once distrust sets in, the ego begins to build quiet defenses, interpreting looks, analyzing silences, preparing for disappointment. When no signs of danger are found, the mind often imagines them simply to avoid being blindsided again. People living like this don't want to, yet they fear feeling that pain again even more. Distrust becomes a filter, affecting how they interpret words, gestures, and affection. Everything is questioned, measured, even unintentionally sabotaged because believing can feel more dangerous than rejecting. Jung understood that this isn't malice, it's protection. The ego distrusts because it learned that trusting hurts. But this protection comes at a cost, the inability to experience real intimacy. One cannot connect while constantly preparing to be wounded. Healing begins with recognizing that we're reacting to the past, not the present. That the fear isn't about what's happening now, but about echoes from earlier pain. It takes courage to pause and ask, is this threat real? Or is it a memory taking over? Trusting again doesn't mean dropping every defense. It means allowing small emotional truth checks. It means realizing the present can be different, that this person isn't the one who hurt you. Distrust isn't a flaw, it's a response. But healing begins when the ego realizes it's no longer at war and can finally rest. There are moments when it feels like the world collapses from within. Trust breaks. Relationships feel threatening. Pain becomes the only companion. In such times, isolation doesn't feel like a choice. It's instinct. The wounded soul pulls back, just like a physical wound recoils from touch, not to punish or manipulate, but because vulnerability feels unsafe. So it retreats, goes quiet, builds invisible walls. From the outside, this looks like coldness or apathy. But on the inside, it's a psychic retreat, a place where the soul attempts to reorganize after being shattered. Jung saw this as symbolic death and rebirth, the shadow pulling in, not because it's given up, but because it's trying to protect itself until it can breathe again. Sometimes, silence is the only language someone in pain can speak, but what begins as refuge can turn into a prison. What was once a pause becomes a pattern. Protection turns into chronic disconnection. Eventually, the soul becomes used to not needing anyone. The heart, though it still beats, locks itself away. Awareness can shift this. There's no urgency, but there is a need for truth. Yes, I pulled away to survive, but maybe I don't have to remain alone forever. This inner truth softens the rigidity. Isolation can transform into solitude, a place where being alone no longer feels like being disconnected. And from that place, reconnection becomes possible, with feelings, with others, with life. Not like before, but more genuinely. Because those who've truly withdrawn know exactly when it's finally safe to open the door again. even just a little, one step at a time. Some people seem unwavering. They speak confidently, walk with purpose, and appear certain. But often behind that composed exterior is a history of pain. Pain that taught them early on that vulnerability wasn't welcomed. Psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott studied this closely. He found that children who weren't emotionally supported developed a false self, a protective facade, built not from choice but necessity. When cries aren't answered, silence becomes the lesson. Years later, this becomes what Jung called the persona, the social mask we all wear. For those who've suffered deeply, though, the mask turns into a golden cage. What once helped them adapt becomes their identity. Control, which once protected, now confines. And the question that lingers is, who would I be if I were free to simply be? We all wear social masks to protect our inner world and adjust to different environments. The problem arises when we start identifying too closely with the mask, when it stops being a tool and starts feeling like our true self. This often happens to people who've experienced deep emotional pain. Those who've faced rejection, humiliation, or abandonment often feel too vulnerable to show their true selves, so they learn to project strength. They try to seem composed, as if nothing affects them. But that image isn't their truth. It's a shield that may appear polished, intelligent, and even effective, but it's lonely. The more rigid the mask, the harder it is to reach the person behind it. This is why people who are hurting may come off as cold, distant, or even arrogant. They're not. They've just built strong walls around themselves. Their ego has learned that showing emotion can cost them, that being seen can feel unsafe. So it creates invisible barriers, rehearsed responses, neutral expressions, automatic replies, all meant to keep their pain locked away, untouchable. But no mask is unbreakable. Over time, it begins to crack, usually when the soul grows tired of hiding, when loneliness becomes unbearable, and when inner silence starts to speak louder than outer appearances. That's when change begins. The question shifts from how do I appear to who am I really? And that's the true start of healing, not by removing the persona completely, but by letting go of the need to hide behind it. Because real strength isn't about pretending nothing hurts. It's about daring to be seen, even while you're still afraid. Empathy doesn't always come from understanding. Sometimes it grows from unhealed wounds. People who have suffered deeply often develop a heightened sensitivity to the pain of others. They notice subtle cues, feel emotions strongly, and are easily moved. At first, this seems like a strength, and often it is. But when empathy stretches beyond healthy limits and becomes a way of avoiding the self, it stops being genuine presence and turns into projection. Many people who feel too much for others are actually responding to their own unacknowledged pain. The suffering they witness in others reflects unresolved wounds within themselves. Instead of turning inward, they try to heal others in the hope of mending what remains broken inside. It's subtle, almost invisible, but it shows. They give too much, lose themselves, and constantly play the role of caretaker. Eventually, this becomes their identity. I'm the one who understands, who handles it, who holds everyone together. But behind this generous giving often lies an unconscious attempt to avoid personal pain. Caring for others feels easier than confronting what's still unsettled within. Carl Jung described this through the concept of projection. When we can't face something inside, we see it outside. With excessive empathy, we reflect our own hurt onto others. And while that can create a sense of connection, it also drains us because any connection built on imbalance cannot last. This kind of unchecked empathy often leads to emotional burnout. The person feels depleted, emotionally overloaded without even realizing why. They end up in relationships where they give, and others simply receive. That's not love, it's emotional codependency, masked as sensitivity. Healing begins with a quiet shift, realizing that caring for others doesn't mean neglecting yourself. True listening to someone else's pain only happens after you've learned to hear your own. And helping doesn't mean carrying someone. It means walking beside them, aware of your own boundaries. Real empathy arises when you've already met your own pain. Then you can be present, not overwhelming, not a savior, just there. Because those who've learned to care for themselves can show up fully for others without losing themselves in the process. And that kind of empathy truly heals. It's quiet, grounded, and deeply human. For someone who's been hurt, love is never simple. It's not the absence of desire, it's the overflow of memory. Every effort to open up is weighed down by what once went wrong. Even if the new partner is different, something inside remains guarded. Affection is there, but so is armor. A connection forms, but with caution. It's love with a protective layer. This emotional self-protection is often mistaken for coldness, but it's not a lack of feeling. It's the outcome of a mind that has learned to guard what was once deeply wounded. The fear isn't always of the new partner, it's of what their closeness might awaken: past abandonment, repeated disappointment, broken trust. So the heart draws near, carefully. And the ego, like a battle-worn soldier, refuses to let the defenses fall. Jung understood that relationships are often the battleground for our inner wounds. In intimacy, our unresolved issues show up the most. That's why people who've been through a lot tend to love with one foot still out the door, always ready to withdraw. It may seem like self-protection, but over time, it weakens the connection. Because true intimacy requires vulnerability, and for that, we must separate the past from the present. The person in front of us isn't the one who caused the pain, but old wounds don't always see clearly. Jung said, "True love begins where projection ends." As long as we project our past fears and traumas onto others, we can't truly see them for who they are. The relationship becomes a struggle between what was and what might be. Instead of bringing freedom, love becomes another burden. Healing in this space takes time, presence, deep listening, and honest reflection. You have to ask, am I reacting to what's happening now or to something that happened before? Trust isn't built in an instant. It grows slowly through realizing there are safe spaces, that not all love brings pain, that it's possible to stay open without losing yourself and trust without disappearing. When that realization dawns, the armor doesn't need to be ripped away. It simply fades, no longer necessary. Some people carry immense burdens quietly. They don't ask for help. They don't show weakness. They're seen as strong, resilient, the ones who can handle anything. But often their strength wasn't chosen. It was born from lack. When no one was there, they had to stand alone. And they did. The strength of someone who has suffered deeply is rooted in survival. It's not loud, it's not showy, it doesn't boast. It's the strength that comes from falling and still rising, from fearing collapse but staying upright anyway. It's a quiet strength, solid, steady, built from pain, effort, and the will to persist. When people suffer deeply, it often sparks a sudden search for their true self, the innermost part of the psyche. When everything on the outside seems to collapse, something within quietly pushes forward. That something holds the soul together when the ego can no longer cope. It's the voice that whispers, "Keep going, even when there's no visible path ahead." It's the self, calling from within the darkness. But if that inner strength isn't balanced with care and compassion, it can turn rigid. The soul, trained to endure, may slowly lose its ability to soften. It becomes hardened, shielded not just from others, but from itself. After holding in so much pain for so long, revealing it can feel like betraying the path traveled. True strength, then, must walk with vulnerability. Being strong doesn't mean never needing anyone. It means recognizing when it's safe to rest in someone's presence. It's being able to say, "I can't do this anymore," without fearing collapse. It's understanding that strength can also be soft. When the soul realizes it no longer needs to fight every battle, a new kind of strength appears. Not the kind that simply survives, but the kind that lives with awareness. It can carry its story without becoming hardened. It honors, it scars, but doesn't need them as proof. That's when the journey becomes less lonely, even if still quiet. Some people live more in their minds than in their bodies. They think constantly, analyzing, replaying, predicting. It can seem like intelligence, but often it's fear in disguise. Overthinking becomes a way to avoid feeling. For those who've suffered deeply, emotions can seem too unstable. Feeling becomes risky when it's tied to pain. So, the ego adapts. It moves everything to the mind, where things can be controlled and understood. But in this effort to control, emotional spontaneity fades. Carl Jung warned, knowledge alone doesn't bring change. He said, knowing is not enough, we must live. And living includes feeling even when it's painful. Excessive thinking is a way the ego keeps pain suspended. But what isn't felt can't be processed, and what isn't processed lingers in the shadows. People who overthink often struggle to name their emotions. They understand what's happening, recognize the patterns, yet remain stuck. That's because understanding without emotional connection becomes a loop. A cycle of thought without movement. Thought feels safe, emotion does not. But the truth is only feeling brings healing. Pain needs to move through the body, not just the mind, to find rest. This doesn't mean drowning in pain. It means being present with it, without needing to explain or justify. Healing doesn't mean thinking less. It means letting thought and feeling coexist, letting the body speak, letting silence settle, letting tears fall. That doesn't weaken, it humanizes. When thinking stops being a shield and becomes a tool, it brings clarity, not protection. And then, slowly, the soul learns that feeling isn't danger, it's life. Some forms of sensitivity aren't learned, they come from pain. People who have suffered often develop a deep, intuitive presence. They listen without judging, sense what others can't express, and know exactly where it hurts, because they've felt it too. These are what Jung called wounded healers, reflecting the myth of Chiron, the centaur who, though wounded, could heal others. But this ability doesn't always come from a place of healing. Sometimes it's an unconscious attempt to fix in others what still hurts within. It's a beautiful impulse, but a risky one. It can lead to neglecting the self. Caring for others becomes a distraction from personal pain. The suffering bridges connection but doesn't lead back inward. The wounded healer archetype is complex. It holds power, the power to turn pain into empathy, but also vulnerability, the danger of hiding behind care. It's as if, by being there for others, they avoid confronting their own absence. That's why many who care for everyone often feel quietly alone. Jung understood this dynamic. He knew the psyche seeks balance, and excessive care for others often reflects inner neglect. When helping others comes with exhaustion, silent resentment, or invisibility, it's a sign something's off. Healing doesn't mean stopping care. It means including yourself in that care, allowing another's pain to touch you but not consume you, listening to others while also listening to yourself, being present without carrying everything, turning wounds into awareness makes the wounded healer truly healing for themselves and others. Care then becomes a choice, not an escape. Not because you must save someone, but because you've learned to walk with your pain and thus can respect. Another's expecting less can look like maturity, but often it's a form of self-protection. When someone's been let down, lied to, or ignored repeatedly, hope begins to feel dangerous. They start expecting less, wanting less, anticipating the worst, to avoid being hurt again. But behind this is unprocessed pain. This way of living might feel safe, but it's limiting. By lowering expectations to avoid pain, we also shut out joy. Relationships lose depth. Dreams stop forming freely. Caution replaces wonder. Joy is dimmed by fear. Jung said the soul seeks expansion. It wants to grow, love, create. But after deep disappointment, it holds back, not because it doesn't want more, but because it's afraid to fall again. Low expectations often signal someone who once waited for something that never came. This isn't weakness, it's protection. A psychological barrier meant to preserve integrity, but if it hardens too much, life starts to pass by half-lived. Everything is filtered through fear. The unknown feels threatening. Becoming aware of this pattern is the first step towards change. It's not about blind optimism, but slowly allowing hope without demanding certainty, realizing you can want something without breaking if it doesn't happen. That opening your heart doesn't mean being careless, but also doesn't mean shutting it completely. Reclaiming hope isn't naive, it's brave. Brave enough to say, despite everything, I still want to live truthfully. Because beneath the scars, a part of you still wants to feel, to connect, to dream. And it's in that small opening that the soul expands again, and life with it. Some pain doesn't end when the moment does. It lingers, echoing for years, not because someone refuses to let go, but because something was never resolved. The past isn't a memory. It feels like the present, like carrying invisible wounds. Only the one bearing them knows their weight. Jung said, "What we resist persists," and few things are resisted more than psychological grief, not the grief of death, but of things that never were. The love that faded, the words never said, the childhood unmet. These invisible losses trap us, tying us to moments long gone but still powerful. The ego tries to move forward without looking back, through denial, minimizing, rationalizing. But the soul doesn't move quickly. It needs space, truth, time. Real grief only begins when we allow ourselves to feel, without judgment or pressure to get over it. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. It means integrating, saying, "This happened, it hurt, it changed me," and then placing it somewhere inside, no longer an open wound, but a story, a scar that no longer bleeds. This process is hard. It asks the ego to stop pretending. It forces the soul to face the truth buried under years of denial. But only when grief is allowed can the past release its grip. Only then do old patterns loosen. Pain stops seeping into new experiences, fighting. The past keeps us trapped. Letting go is a quiet act of courage. It says, "I accept what happened, but I won't live from it anymore." That's when healing begins. Not because the pain disappears, but because it finds its place. When grief completes, the present becomes real, and the future becomes a space for new creation. Behind every defense is a story. Behind every story, an effort to survive. What looks like a flaw in someone who has suffered too much is often their way of enduring chaos. Jung understood this. He knew pain reshapes us, not out of cruelty, but to help us survive. What seems like coldness may be containment. What looks like pride may be protection. What sounds like distance may simply be fear, learned early, repeated so often it became part of the structure. That's why healing doesn't start with judgment, but with listening. Not with breaking down, but with presence. Individuation. The Jungian journey of becoming yourself doesn't happen in spite of pain. It happens through it, By facing what hurts, we find what must be changed. By bringing light to what we've hidden or denied, we start to rebuild ourselves. Pain, once brought into awareness, becomes a source of connection. The wound doesn't vanish, but it shifts. It's no longer the center, just a part. And in this reorganization, we gain something no theory can teach: presence with our experience. Healing isn't quick, it isn't linear, but it's real. It begins when we stop judging behaviors, ours and others, and start seeing the survival behind them. Real empathy is born there. And with empathy comes freedom, freedom to be more human, more whole. Because once pain is acknowledged, it doesn't define us, it reveals us. That's the real transformation, understanding that suffering isn't the end. It's a doorway, a call to return to ourselves, an invitation to live truthfully, not in spite of what hurt us, but because we chose to face it with courage and clarity. If this touched something in you, if a quiet part of your story felt seen, subscribe and turn on notifications. Here we talk about self-awareness, deep psychology, and the healing path of the conscious soul. And if you're still here, I ask one small thing. Comment below saying, "I'm learning to listen to my pain." That phrase tells me you stayed to the end, and more importantly, that you're willing to turn your pain into a path. And that already is a beginning. See you in the next video.